Hello, I'm joined today by one of the presidential elect candidates, Greg Tsuman. Greg, how are you doing?
Really good, David. Thank you very much for having me on the show.
Well, big thank you to you. It's actually it's Bank Holiday Friday. It's the Jubilee weekend. You are away on holiday. I'm off on holiday. We're both giving our time, so thank you very much for dropping in with us today. We just thought it's important that people sort of get to know who those candidates are, and obviously we've heard from the other two. For people who don't know who you are, you're obviously part of quite a well-established firm, Martin Gerrard. But give us a little bit more of your sort of background and your route into property, Greg.
Okay, well, I'll try to keep it short. Greg Tsuman, Lettings Director of Martin Gerrard, been with the company for just over 20 years. Also sit on the board of ARLA Propertymark. Have been an exec in the past, and I'm also on the industry steering group for member benefits. So hopefully all the hard work that we're putting in will start to show very, very soon. So yeah, I mean, I didn't really get into lettings through particular choice, but when the dot-com bust happened and I was made redundant for the first time ever, I thought, well, how can I protect myself from this happening again? And as they say, safe as houses, you either selling food or you selling property. By selling, I mean letting or selling. I've been in sales initially and then moved into lettings. I know it's normally the other way around, but it has worked out for me so far.
And obviously the sector has changed quite a bit since you got into it. There's been increased sort of regulation added, and it feels like there's more and more regulation being added every day or every year, and that we'd be forgiven for thinking that life for landlords and in many respects for lettings agents is becoming harder through this sort of regulation. A lot of it's necessary. It brings our properties up to standard. But a lot of it as well, I think, would you have got into lettings today in the same way that you did back then, if today was your first sort of go at it?
Well, it might be surprising to hear, but the answer is yes, I would. And whilst there is a lot of legislation that has been introduced since I got into it, there've also been some relaxations. So, for example, I don't know if you remember, but back in the day, you could well, you wouldn't be able to enforce an eviction if your tenancy agreement wasn't stamped.
Yes.
You had to send it off and sort of pay for that. So it swings and roundabouts, and I think that I'm all for regulation. I think that it's important to have decent homes and decent standards, affordable rents and all of that. But it's how we get there. I think it's about the unintended consequences and assessing those before making any drastic decisions. I mean, if you look at 2016 and George Osborne's policies, I've been talking about it forever and a day. It was all with good intentions. We all want more home ownership. We want people to be able to afford to get onto the property ladder, but unfortunately some can't, or some choose not to because it's not the right time in their lives. Now, through that sort of forced push, the additional 3% stamp duty for landlords, we've created a distorted market. And we are seeing the fruits of that come now. And I'm afraid it's turning into a little bit of a perfect storm. The cost of living crisis, rents spiking, landlords selling up, all of that, it can be quite an unnerving time for letting agents. So, and this is why I felt it was really important for me to volunteer even more of my time to have a say and a more meaningful impact on how we shape the industry going forward. So that's where I sit so far.
It's interesting. Well, that was going to be my next question. So why put yourself forward now? clearly very busy. You've got lots of stuff going on, and you contribute to Propertymark in no small way through your board membership and all of that. This obviously sort of takes you to that next level, I suppose. It's a little bit more of a public figurehead. Some people would say, controversially, it's only a figurehead. So you turn up at all the regional meetings, you wave your royal scepter in the air, and people sort of wave back to you, but that the actual president-elect or president don't really have that much day-to-day sort of say on the running of things. How do you see the position?
I see the position as being the voice of the membership, I suppose, because through the presidential position, sort of as it progresses, you get so many opportunities to speak with the media, the decision makers. And I remember at one of the ARLA conferences, as Campbell said, just when you're sick and tired of repeating yourself, does the public start paying attention? So we've all been going on about it forever and ever and ever, and nobody's paying attention. Not shelter, not generation rent, and they're hurting the people who they are trying to protect.
Yeah.
Now, what I really want to do is I want to make sure that we're not fighting them in a way that, oh, we're opposed to shelter, we're opposed to generation rent. No, we're opposed to silly comments. We're opposed to comments that haven't been properly thought through. We're opposed to policies that they are lobbying, which will hurt the very people they try to protect. So I think being a voice of the industry is really, really important. It's an opportunity. It's comes with a lot of responsibility. And I think that working with Propertymark, with a fantastic board that we've got, with the regional executives who are giving up so much of their time volunteering for this great cause. I think it's just being that sort of person who they can lean on, who can support them even more in what they already do. I think this is really important. From me personally, that's how I feel.
And that's great in terms of what it delivers to the actual sort of Propertymark members. Let me ask you perhaps slightly a different question. Propertymark members, if you talk to them, and a lot of them these days, this is perhaps what makes me feel that Propertymark is a little bit more viable than it ever was before, is that you've got young voices, you've got very enthusiastic voices, you've got people who are incredibly proud to be geeky about certain aspects. Now, I know that you're a self-confessed spreadsheet freak. I know that that's your idea of a good weekend. But for others, it might be legislation, particularly around the sort of letting sector. And I think when you speak to an average sort of Propertymark member, you hear them talking about it, they'll talk about legislation. They'll talk about how they're effectively self-regulating themselves and they are furthering themselves. It's all about the knowledge. It's all about what they're learning. It's what grade of qualification they've got. And that qualification, they feel, sort of places them in the best possible place to help landlords, sellers, whoever it is really that we come into contact with. It can also be the tenants and buyers as well on the other side of that equation. But they feel that it best places them to be as professional as possible. My question has always been, I know this matters intensely to Propertymark members. Do we think it matters as much to members of the public? So walking into meet a landlord for the first time, when you say, listen, I just want to let you know who I am and what we do. And by the way, we're on a Propertymark. Do landlords consider that? Is it given as much prominence and importance as we would like to think it does?
Well, I think it's a fantastic question because it's such a complex question because yes, it really, really matters. The problem is that most landlords don't yet realize it fully. And I'm very pleased to say that speaking to our valuers, when I meet landlords, when I meet portfolio landlords, I think the reassurance that ARLA Propertymark protected badge gives them It is really recognizable now. I think, I can't remember how many years, but we had a TV campaign. It certainly raised our profile. Following that, the work that is happening on social media promoting ARLA Propertymark to the general public, and also just mentioning it every time you go on a market appraisal is really, really important. So going back to your question about legislation, legislation is so complex that I get calls from solicitors asking how I would apply a certain bit of the sort of law to the puzzle, because applying it in practice versus knowing sort of what clause of a particular act, what section of a particular act we're referring to is as important, if not even more important. I'll give you an example. During the pandemic, there was a moratorium on evictions. You couldn't evict a tenant. Then Section 21 notices were extended, then reduced, then there was a lot of confusion how to apply it. And with my managers, in one of our lettings managers meetings, I said, guys, look, this is a scenario. You've got to evict a tenant. You have to serve Section 21 notice of 3 months. After this date, it will drop to 2 months. What should we do? Everybody said, well, of course, you're better off waiting for another few weeks and then serving 2-month notice. It'll be quicker to recover possession, etc., etc. There was one gentleman, he turns around and says, and also somebody I wouldn't expect to come up with a solution. And he goes, well, why don't you speak to the tenant and ask them if they can leave a little bit earlier? Have they found something? Do they need some help?
Yeah.
And as obvious as that is, it wasn't the initial reaction of the majority. Now, so legislation is really, really important, but knowing how to apply it and sometimes avoiding court proceedings is much more important than knowing.
You know what? I think that's a great point. I think that what I take from that is that sometimes we build the actual legislation side of things up and we hold it on a pedestal, really, and we almost take, if we're not careful, we can take the human interaction out of our dealings by just relying on the full letter of the law and saying, look, you know, all you ever do is you serve a notice, you serve it in this way, you make sure that you've got a receipt, you make sure that it's been served in a certain way, you make sure you've got evidence, and we're used to that within our industry. So anybody that's sort of dealt with any part of that lettings process, a lot of what we do is it's inbuilt steps and processes that we've put in place to make sure that if we ever had to prove anything to somebody else later on down the line, we've got a stack of evidence. And yet sometimes all it will take is picking up the phone and saying, look, you know, this is the, I'm not saying you bypass legislation by any means. You can do it in, you know, alongside that in parallel. But that human interaction, just as you suggested, can make all the difference. And it makes, I suppose, applying legislation a lot warmer rather than being a cold slap in the face for a tenant or a landlord or whoever else it may be.
And I think the pandemic proved just how important that human interaction is. Being able to listen to tenants. I mean, we've been a shoulder to lean on, sometimes even a shoulder to cry on during the pandemic. And it's being able to pick up the phone. So forget the email. We are so obsessed with prop tech and everything that makes our life easier. And we forget that it is there as an add-on, as a tool, rather than sort of replacement. Absolutely right. And I think that nothing will ever beat human interaction. The internet, fantastic, but you still have to do the human bit. Now, picking up the phone and having a conversation, just saying, look, this is why the landlord is asking this. How can that fit in with your plans? How can we work together? How can we make it work? And I think that education bit is as important as legislation itself. Knowing legislation is paramount. You must know what you're doing. If you don't know what you're doing, you just, well, I'm going to stop there. But you do need to know what you're doing, but you also need to know how to apply it.
In terms of the way that Propertymark It's interesting. I think that when you have a conversation with people about Propertymark, you've got to, I think you have to understand, and I think the Propertymark sometimes have to remember this and understand it, that you don't just represent your members, you represent everybody, even those that aren't your members, because you're speaking for an industry. And in many ways, your members, by accepting the code of practice, they're they're the choir. You're preaching to them, and they know the way already. There's others out there who you're an advocate for as well. But in terms of the way that Propertymark is seen, we spoke briefly yesterday, and we decided to go ahead with this interview today on the basis that yes, you are on holiday and you're not going to be suited and booted, and needless to say, neither am I. But the point of that is that we use the words more informal and relaxed. But when you talk about Propertymark, it was always seen as quite a stuffy institute back in the day. And there's a sense that it's sort of beginning to loosen its tie. Maybe that top button is coming undone and we're just getting a little bit comfortable with it. But in terms of actually speaking to everybody within the industry, do you think that effort to sort of relax how seriously it takes itself sometimes is an ongoing thing?
There's a time and a place for everything. There's a time and a place to wear a suit and tie. And as I'm sure you've seen, most of my photographs are suit and booted. But there's also a time and a place where look, we're having an informal chat. Does it make us any less professional? I don't think it does. It allows our conversation to flow. I think it's important to focus on the substance rather than the front, as it were. So somebody who wears a suit and tie, spiky hair, big dangly keys, look, okay, I was one of those. I remember when my appearance was far further advanced than my knowledge, and now you realize that a lot of business is done remotely. Many people are now based abroad. They've moved out of the local areas. Quite a lot of our landlords no longer live within half a mile radius of where their properties are, which is why property management becomes so important. And then when you're choosing an agent to manage your property, you're most likely your most expensive asset. What do you choose it on? Do you choose it based on how somebody looks? Do you choose it based on how much knowledge they have? Do you base it on reviews? Do you base it on sort of personal recommendations? There's so much that goes into it. But yeah, I mean, going back to the original point, I think Propertymark, I've never actually seen it as this old boys club that is being portrayed to be. I've been involved with Propertymark since 2009. I did my level 3 exams. I was very, very proud of that. I felt it gave me knowledge. I never did it to, I know it'll sound sort of strange, I never did it to become a member of ARLA, which is why I needed to pass it. I wanted to be a member of ARLA, but more importantly, an expert at what I do, which is why I studied the legal aspect more than anything else. And in my unit 2, I got 100%. And again, this is something that I remain proud of. So it's knowing what you need to know, then not giving it too much emphasis. Don't take yourself too seriously, and just try to help people, because there are so many younger members who've been where we were 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago. You continue evolving, it never stops. The legislation keeps changing. The perceptions keep changing. The economy keeps changing. There are so many different variables that you will never be able to predict and plan for everything. You've got to be the most adaptable of the bunch.
You spoke earlier about 2 organizations that get a few headlines here and there, and I think they're It's probably fair to say they only get the headlines because their headlines are purposely sensationalist. They are misleading the public sometimes in terms of the nature of the truth. And obviously, I'm talking now to and about shelter, particularly where we as an industry, we wake up to read these things. Now, I can live with things being reported in property industry because that's really, well, that's relevant to me because it's my industry, but the wider public don't necessarily read that. But when it starts to seep out into inevitably Daily Mail type publications, and then it's sort of all over the place, some of the messages that organizations like Shelter, and they've got a very powerful voice, are giving about lettings agents, about the way that we handle things, are, they're casting doubt. And I think more than that, I think they're putting blame actually firmly in our corner as agents, if you like, as to who's responsible for the housing crisis, as it were, in terms of people getting into affordable homes and having, a decent standard of housing. My view probably echoes that of many people within the industry, that if they were to only put their mouthpiece that they've got, and it's a very powerful mouthpiece, and all the millions of pounds that they raise, if they were to put it to actually housing people and taking steps that get a single homeless person off the street and into housing and into an infrastructure that works for everybody, that I think would be a tremendously sound organization. I wouldn't have an issue with that. But where they only exist to deride the private rented sector, which I don't think they've fully understood, is going to have to take up the slack of all the kind of failings of the public sector. To me, it's intensely frustrating, and I know it's something that you guys at Propertymark deal with all the time. How do you think we further that conversation with an organization like that?
Well, firstly, I think we've got to accept a few simple things. Rehousing people, reducing homelessness is difficult. Making agents scapegoats is easy. And that's what most organizations do. They follow the easy route. Now, Shelter, Generation Rent. I think the causes that they're sort of trying to promote are very worthy. I really do. And I think it's an absolute tragedy what we're seeing right now with the housing crisis. The fact that families are having to be sort of moved on from their local communities, moving out of their sort of towns and cities where they're used to living and bringing up their children. Equally, we need to look at the cause of that problem, and the cause are not estate agents, or landlords for that matter. Now, simple economics. If you've got 10 houses and 10 families, prices stay stable. There's no need for it to increase. If 5 landlords sell up and those 10 people are now fighting over 5 homes, prices are going to increase. You turn 10 properties into 20 properties, rents are going to fall. Yeah. Yeah. How difficult is that? Yeah. And it's really important to just keep it really, really simple. It's not hard. Yes, all the sort of 20 housing ministers that we've had recently will try and get you to think that, oh, it's so difficult, it's such a sort of complex problem to solve. You might need to introduce rent controls. You might need to introduce a moratorium on evictions. You can't serve Section 21s anymore. And but the simple truth is, no landlord wants to evict a good tenant. Why would they want to evict a good tenant? They're paying rent. The landlord sort of came into the buy-to-let sector specifically to find a good tenant who needs a home to rent. Now, Shelter would rather focus on the exceptions to the rule and on the, I can't remember what the exact statistics were, but it's about 3% of people who've seen an eviction notice last year. 3% of the private rented sector. And the 97% who don't even know what it is, yeah, majority of tenants don't even realize that receiving Section 21 notice means that it's just the landlord's confirmation that at this date, they would like to get their property back. It doesn't mean that the tenant has to be evicted. Mind you, several local councils are advising tenants exactly that. They're saying, don't worry, you don't need to move out. Just wait for the bailiffs to knock on the door. And if you do move out, we'll consider you making yourselves voluntarily homeless.
And that is the truth of it. For years,
Absolutely.
local authorities up and down this country have turned around to people and said, look, the public rented sector is only ever going to come to your assistance if you purposely place yourself in a position where you are being made homeless. So they're advising people on how to escalate it in order to get onto these lists. And you know, I don't think that's the side of the story that's ever told. Agents know about it, you know about it, I know about it because we deal with it every day. But members of the public would be horrified to find that out.
Well, you and I will probably remember when Brandon Lewis was the housing minister. He wrote an open letter to all the local governments saying, we understand that this practice is happening. Please let me clarify that there's absolutely no need for you to wait for bailiffs to knock on the door. Please start assisting your, not customers, but your local community as soon as they receive a Section 21 notice. There is no need to wait. But ironically, only 6 months later, at the ARLA conference, when Brandon Lewis was one of the speakers, a question was put to him saying, well, why are you allowing the councils to do that? He had no recollection of sending that letter. So
that speaks about big government, though. I think that's it, that's down to, and I think that's actually, you know, one of the points really. We don't tend to hang on to housing ministers longer than most of us, you know, can keep a fresh pair of pants going. It's a very short amount of time that we get these guys for. It's in a sense, we get the impression that it's a political portfolio that nobody wants to take on. You never come into government thinking one day I'm going to be housing minister. You may think, oh, I'll be foreign secretary, I'll be whatever it may be. But it's important. It's a vastly important sector. And I think that when the numbers start to speak to government, so i.e. the house builders have a very strong voice with government. We saw that in the pandemic when we were sent back to work, largely because the builders needed to put their workforce back to work. And they said, look, we're not sending people back to work unless the estate agents are able to sell houses, because otherwise this whole thing will grind to a halt. But when you look at that, and you look at the sort of power that other groups have, it's frustrating for us, isn't it, in our sector. We're not a massive industry by anybody's standards, but we're essential.
Absolutely right.
We're as essential as it gets.
Well, and I think the government have recognized that. We were one of the first industries allowed back into the workplace. I remember, I think it was 13th of May, 2019, if I'm not mistaken, and everybody sort of sitting on their in their lounges watching Mr. Johnson address the nation, and then sort of there were sort of glimmers of hope emerging, and I think we should be very proud as an industry of how we handled that. We followed the advice, we kept everybody safe. It was essential to kickstart the economy. So I'm personally very proud to be part of that. I remember when the housing ministers, you're quite right. And sorry, I'm just jumping back and forth. But you've made a couple of really interesting points there. So housing ministers are a carousel. There are so many of them. But Propertymark are one of the few constants that keep reminding the new housing ministers of the course and the vector that we chose before. So if the intention was, and I remember the logos keep changing, sort of the Tenants Fees Act 2019, as it was going through Parliament, the intention was Fairness and transparency. Now, who can argue with that? Fairness and transparency are fantastic.
Universal values anyone can get behind.
Absolutely. Right? How can you argue with it, right? Now, when under that logo, you go in and you start through the back door, increasing tenants' costs in renting, because you can no longer be transparent. How can you say, right, these are our fees, we charge £100 for an application per tenant.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, nobody can charge anything. Okay, I suppose from that side, it is transparent. But how much has the landlord added on top of his rent to get those costs back? Does it matter if it's a 3-bedroom house? Does it matter if it's a 5-bedroom house? If it's a studio? Yeah. Now, we'll never know how much the rents would have been without the tenant fees ban. Yeah. Equally, right now, we've got a unprecedented shortage of property to rent. I mean, anyone you speak to will tell you the same thing. In the 20 years that I've been doing this, I've not come across anything near this. Rents are spiking. We've had one property that achieved 38% more than it did last year.
Wow.
So in 12 months, 38%. Now, on top of that, everyone's fuel bills have gone up. My bill has doubled since last year.
Yeah.
And I'm being told that that's still a very good deal compared to all the others. Now, if you consider that your rent is going up by 30%, your bills have gone up by 100%, the squeeze on what's left for you to spend at the end of the month is
huge. Yeah,
is certainly noticeable. Yeah. Now, how do we affect these things? So the knee-jerk reaction from landlords is, well, if my tenant can't pay, I'm just going to sell up. If the government keeping sort of the policy of throwing legislation and regulation whenever there's a problem, so shortage of housing, how do we fix it? Let's make it harder for landlords. Okay, well, that makes sense, doesn't it? And if more landlords sell up, there's going to be even less available. And the problem is that landlords used to sell all the time. It's not a new phenomenon. Yeah? Personal circumstances change. Somebody's ready to retire. Accidental landlord who only became a landlord in 2008 when they couldn't sell the property. Maybe now is the time to sell for them. But historically, there was always somebody else who would step into the market, buy that property and put it back on the property private sector rental market. We're not seeing that. We are seeing some build to rent, thankfully. We're seeing some landlords looking around and potentially entering the market, but nowhere near on the scale that is needed. Literally, right now, if you look at it, and you quite rightly pointed out that I'm a bit of an Excel geek, I do these things for fun. If you follow inflation and Bank of England base rates, you can see that they've been detached for, well, ever since the credit crunch.
Yeah.
If you look at the demand from tenants, that has just spiked to unprecedented levels. This is ARLA Propertymark research data. Spiking like never before. Internally, I keep track of numbers of applicants registered in our books versus number of properties available to rent. We've gone from 5 in May 2021 to 35 this May. Now, from 5 people competing for each property to 35 people competing for each property.
Yeah, it's crazy. You know what? It's funny talking to you now, this side of sort of a pandemic in 2022, and having sort of worked through very similar markets to you. So I'm probably started a little bit younger, and I've maybe got 25 years in this industry, but we've lived through the same governments and the same legislation. But it's funny looking back now to understand and see that a sort of a centre-left leaning Labour government like Tony Blair was so much better for the property market and for actually getting people into housing than a far right leaning sort of conservative government where you'd think that landlords would naturally get all the business breaks and they're all about supporting businesses and sort of capitalist culture, if you like. And that simply hasn't been the case. It's almost like they've seen it as low-hanging fruit. They had for a long time, if you think about it, under somebody like Corbyn, as left-leaning an opposition as possible, who were never going to give the government any kind of stick for going after landlords. So you can see where the perfect storm has arisen, but it's I think it's probably accepted. Certain governments have been better for business and better for tenants than others.
And it's, you know what, hindsight's a wonderful thing. And looking at Tony Blair years, and I remember sort of the housing booms then, I also remember the crash that followed. So it's difficult to, but you can't print your way out of everything. And we seem to be printing money, and it was necessary to do so after the pandemic. We will see an effect of that. And,
Sure.
and I think we are seeing some of that through inflation. Landlords have been a scapegoat with cross-party support. There hasn't been anyone who had a strong enough voice who could speak up and say, guys, have you considered the unintended consequences? Yes, your slogans are fantastic. Yes, they're going to get you votes. Yes, you will probably win the next election if you promise people this. But what price will you have to pay further down the line? And this is the age-old thing. So promise people the world, but when it comes to deliver, you need to have a long enough strategy. And I think the strategy in the private rented sector has been lacking. We were focused on home ownership, which is right, but there is a segment of our population, a very significant, large number of people who are in private rented sector for one reason or another. They're not going to become homeowners overnight. Interest rates are rising. The cost of borrowing has increased. Property prices have gone up in the last 2 years significantly. Let's call it that. Even those who had savings and did their maths with a financial advisor and thought they could buy 12 months ago may not be in that position today. And what we see happening, the difference, because when tenants were leaving, landlords were selling. When tenants weren't paying rent, landlords were trying to take steps to recover their property and then potentially sell. We're having regular conversations highlighting the benefits of being a landlord and just enticing landlords to say, but reminding them that they're providing an essential service, because the waiting lists in the social housing sector are just, well,
yeah,
not even worth registering, in my opinion, because it would take you years and years and years.
Yeah.
So how do we get out of it? Who will be brave enough to actually say, well, do you know what? Yes, we've been bashing landlords for long enough. Interestingly, the Telegraph have started some really, really good coverage highlighting those unintended consequences. There's a specific journalist, Melissa Lawford. She's released a couple of articles with a very balanced viewpoint. It's actually really, really interesting to read her articles. I would recommend it to anyone. If we do not take steps now, the situation will become worse in a year's time.
Yeah, it's not going to get better on its own. And we, as the public now, not necessarily as agents, but we can't continue to bury our heads in the sand. And the sort of stereotype, it's interesting, you said it's not even worth registering. That stereotype of a certain type of person who wants to take advantage of the welfare state, let's just take a minute and understand what that means in today's context. If you need help, it's not ready. It's not readily available. You don't just rock up at the local job centre at your local council and say, I'm homeless, I need housing. This can take weeks and months before you get anywhere near it. And in the meantime, you have all those other pressures and strains. So that's the reality of life today. Greg,
Well, David, sorry, and just to add to that, I'm sorry for interrupting you, but
no,
it goes further. When you look at the local government and the planning rules, we have developers who are sitting on projects ready to build. Central government have said, okay, provided you meet these basic requirements, so building on top of an existing sort of 3-story block, etc., subject to rules and regulations, you can build with simplified planning. It's just simply not happening. We have developers who are ready to go, and they're being stopped. And I think that's there's no excuse for it.
yeah, I've heard of that. I also feel that sometimes that the requirement for developers to make a certain amount available for what really should be classed as social housing, but we're talking about, we call it affordable housing nowadays. Sometimes you see them able to sort of shirk their responsibilities to the public in that by making up for it in other ways. Because simply put, if you're building 100 shiny apartments, you don't want 2 there that just don't fit in with everybody else, which is extremely sad. I've seen this is not necessarily prevalent in my part of the world, down here in the north or up here in the north, but I've heard in the south of England there are those lovely buildings that have been built for sort of that build to rent sector, where one half of the building is almost like pristine boutique hotel, and the other half of the building has its own a different entrance, and it's just a down market version of it. It saddens me, that sort of thing. And as much as I know we've all got to make money, it really bothers me that we'll never make, unless we take away that stigma, if you like, over affordable housing, we'll never really truly bring the two into parity.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And when I moved to the area where I started working in the estate agency, I lived in an ex-local authority property.
Yeah.
And I know firsthand how it can be. The certain nuances that I think you and I both know about. Equally, there was still a sense of community. And I think that sense of community is going to disappear if we keep forcing people out of the areas. And I know that Shelter would say, well, cap rents and everybody can stay where they live. But that's not really an answer, because no landlord is going to continue renting a property that's not breaking even, let alone make a profit. So what are they going to do? They're going to reduce the supply. And okay, what are you going to do? You're going to give tenants assured tenancies like we had before the Section 21 notice? Well, every landlord is going to sell out straight away. And you're going to exacerbate the problem. Now, we need to think a little bit outside the box. And I think the only solution is building, increasing supply. The population of UK has increased. I can't remember exactly the figures, but I think it was close enough to 5 million over the last 10 years. Now, I don't know the exact figures again, but I know with 100% certainty that we've not built 5 million homes in the last 10 years.
There's a man that knows his stats.
Well, even the government have admitted that they will miss their target of 250, 300 homes being built this year by a country mark. They will never get anywhere near that. Despite so many small, medium developers sitting on projects where they just need the green light, and they will build and they will release those properties into the private rented sector if need be. But they're being prevented from doing so. Their hands are tied behind their backs. It's borderline criminal.
Let me ask you something else, and this is a cheekier question, but you're the last guy in. I'm afraid you're the last. This is the section of my interview I like to call last agent in, because if I were to ask an estate agent whether they'd like to be the first agent giving their pitch to a landlord or a seller, or the last one, I think we all agree that the slot we all want is the last one, because you stand a better chance of people remembering who you are. However wonderful your pitch was, if they've seen 3 or 4 agents in between, it's never a good thing. You've got the ability to perhaps talk to them about the other things that agents have said to them and address those concerns. So given that you're the last candidate to do this interview, but you have looked at the other 2 interviews, what is it that you feel you'd like the Propertymark members who are, you said something really, really interesting, but I think it's bang on the money. When we spoke on the phone, you said that the first wave of votes has probably already been cast. And there's a bunch of people milling around now that perhaps haven't made their mind up which way they're going to vote and who should represent them. And this really is for them, for those people, because the people that have already cast their vote, they're kind of sure about what they want. You're all very different as candidates. You've got different backgrounds, different passions, different things that motivate you guys. What is it that you as Greg feel that you're bringing to the table that perhaps, without necessarily talking about the other candidates derogatory in derogatory fashion, but you've obviously heard them speak. What is it that you feel that you're able to bring to the table that genuinely is that Greg Tsuman difference?
Well, firstly, I'd never speak derogatory about Darshan or Sean. I think they're fantastic candidates, and I think that Propertymark would be in good hands with either of them. Equally, using the market appraisal analogy, even the last person in can still mess it up. So I hope I haven't messed it up. And look, the one thing that you can hopefully see from this interview, and anybody who's met me will tell you, I have tons of energy. I'm very passionate about the industry. I will do my absolute best to communicate our policies to those who are prepared to listen, and even those who are not. So what can I bring to the table? Having been with Propertymark for as long as I have, having built so many valuable friendships and great relationships at all levels in the industry, I'd like to think that I can be the voice that helps us get to where we need to be. And I think that my views are very much aligned with the majority of membership. Whilst member benefits are hugely, hugely important, I think we've got a very, very challenging time ahead of us with the housing crisis gathering pace. And I hope that members see me as somebody who they can trust to communicate their points across to those who matter.
That's it. That's all it ever needed to be. That's good. It's a good message. It's a good message, and I think that what I love about this election is that there is an election, and I don't wish to talk about any. I'm not interviewing any of the other candidates for other positions where, particularly, you've only got one person going for it. To me, as great as that is for the person that's going for it, and hats off that it's a walk into that position. It feels great when a position is seen as being important enough or matters enough for people to actually want to compete over it. So I think that, this time round, this feels like you've got 3 very strong candidates. They've all got good messages. They've all care passionately about their industry, and are actively sort of delivering value, if you like, to the industry every day. That's the way it should be. Yeah, so I can't say anything nicer than that about Propertymark at the moment. I've got to tell you, very much impressed by, and I know this comes from sort of board level, impressed by the sort of things that they're doing, and the sort of support that you're now starting to offer one another, I think, on a more active basis. That's also coming across. If you look at the sort of Facebook groups and what goes on behind the scenes, the messages, support. The message is almost family, if I could use that word. But
Do you know what? It's so good that you've picked up on that, because this is exactly what we're trying to create among the execs, amongst the board, amongst the main Propertymark board, and Urban House as well. There's some fantastic people there. The marketing that we're doing, the lobbying, policy, member services, everything is just, it's clicking together. It's a great place to be. It's a great time to be part of Propertymark.
Fantastic. Greg, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, David.
And good luck. Good luck in the election.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Fingers crossed. Please vote.